So now let's talk about blood. We're going to start by talking about a little bit of the historical context of blood and why it's been viewed as sort of a magical fluid. We'll then go over exactly what the functions of blood are, what it does for our bodies. Then we'll talk about some of the components of blood. We'll start by talking about the plasma, what's in the plasma, what it's made of. And then we'll go into the formed elements, which are the cells and cell fragments. So we'll cover the erythrocytes, or red blood cells, leukocytes, or white blood cells, and thrombocytes, which are responsible for coagulation. So let's talk a little bit about blood. Now, historically speaking, blood has often been viewed as sort of a magical fluid, which makes sense. If you imagine you're in a pre-scientific society, what do you know about the human body? You know that humans are alive. That's pretty magical on its own. You know that if you cut them, red stuff comes out, and if enough of that red stuff comes out, they die. So it is totally reasonable to conclude that the red stuff that comes out has some sort of magical life-giving properties. Now, if you then add the observation that women, who are the source of new life, bleed once a month but don't die, that blood comes from the same place that new human lives come from, and that in the process of childbirth, a great deal of blood is often involved. And you could reach at several conclusions. One, that blood is life, and two, that women are powerful sources of life-giving magic. Again, totally reasonable conclusions to reach. Now, in this class, I am not going to associate blood with magic exactly, but that doesn't mean that it isn't pretty amazing stuff. We consider blood a liquid connective tissue, and it contains an enormous variety of molecules, cells, and cell fragments. All of those together serve this huge variety of functions. Add to that the stuff that blood has the ability to plug holes in its own vessels, and it's pretty special. So let's get into exactly how blood works, what it does for us, and what it's made of. Let's go over some of what blood does for us. So on my list of blood functions here, we have a variety of things. Let's start with gas transport. So oxygen, for example, is carried in the blood, and that oxygen can diffuse from the blood into the extracellular fluid and from there get to the body cells. So we can bring oxygen to the cells. Also, these cells produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. That carbon dioxide goes into the extracellular fluid and then is carried away in the blood. We'll talk more about how oxygen and carbon dioxide are carried in the blood later in this unit and more in the respiratory system later on. Another function is nutrient transport. So I've got nutrients transported in the blood. Those are also brought to my cells. Things like glucose, amino acids, and other useful materials for my cells are brought to them by the blood. The blood is also transporting metabolic wastes. So as my cells produce wastes, things like, well, carbon dioxide is a waste, but also things like urea or even bilirubin and other such materials, those are then transported away from my cells by the blood. The blood also acts as a way of sending messages. So cells at one place in the body can secrete messenger molecules, which if they're put into the blood, we call hormones. Those hormones then travel throughout the bloodstream and can act on any cells that have receptors for them. So this hormone secreted by these cells up here can affect cells anywhere else in the body that might have receptors for that hormone. Then there's a couple of other functions. The blood acts as a reservoir for water in the body. Water can move back and forth between the blood and the extracellular fluid based on osmolarity. We'll talk a little bit later about how the blood maintains its osmolarity so that we can regulate which way the water is going. And finally, the blood serves as a heat transfer fluid. So if you drive a car that burns gasoline, the exploding gasoline in your car engine produces a great deal of heat. And in order for that heat not to damage your engine, you have to have it absorbed by some sort of circulating coolant fluid, which then takes that heat to a radiator where it can be given to the air going by the car. In a similar way, your cells undergoing metabolism produce a lot of heat. And to take some of that heat from those cells and get it outside the body, your blood picks up that heat, carries it to your skin and lungs where it can be given off to the air. Blood is composed of two main fractions. So here on this diagram, what I've got is a tube, and we've imagined that we've taken some blood and then run it through a centrifuge so that the heavier, denser parts have sunk to the bottom of the tube and the less dense parts are here at the top. And here we can see that this has been now separated into two major components. This part over here, this top part, which is sort of in yellow, this is the blood plasma. Plasma is the water plus the things that are dissolved in the water. Whereas this other part down here are what we call the formed elements. Which are cells and cell fragments. The plasma will make up, depending on the person and their sex, a little bit, about half to a little bit more than half of the blood. The formed elements somewhere between half and a little bit less than half of the blood. The percentage of the blood by volume that's comprised of the red blood cells is what we call the hematocrit. This is an important clinical measurement. How much of the blood is red blood cells varies depending on gender and health conditions, but for women, this would typically be about 37 to 45% of the blood, and in males it would be a little bit more, typically about 40 to 50% of the blood. Now, there is a very small part of the formed elements here, you can see in gray, that is often called the buffy coat. That buffy coat is the white blood cells and the platelets. But that really comprises usually less than 1% of the blood by volume. So saying the hematocrit and the percentage of blood, which is the formed elements, are pretty close to the same thing, which means that the plasma, the watery part, makes up somewhere between 50 to 60% of the blood volume in a typical person. So what we're going to talk about next is what's in that plasma. Blood plasma is about 92% water by weight. So almost all of this plasma part is water. This is one of the major water reservoirs of the body. Of the remaining part, we've got about 7% protein, which is a fair amount of protein for a solution. If you've ever actually felt blood plasma, you know it has this sort of odd texture, kind of slippery and sticky at the same time. That mostly comes from the protein. The remaining 1%, the ever-popular other category, that would include things like gases, ions, non-protein nutrients, wastes, etc. Basically, everything that's dissolved in the water that isn't a protein. That all together makes up just a very small fraction of the weight of blood plasma. Now, because those proteins are so abundant, let's talk a little bit about what plasma proteins we have. The most abundant plasma protein is albumin. Albumin comes from the liver, and it has a couple of main jobs. One of them is to increase the plasma osmolarity. We want the plasma osmolarity not to be too low because we don't want all of the water in our blood getting pulled into the extracellular fluid and cells by the concentration of stuff in there. So the albumin is in the plasma to help maintain its osmolarity high enough to keep water moving back and forth between blood plasma and extracellular fluid. It also helps to transport lipophilic things. Things like fatty acids or steroids or other lipophilic molecules don't dissolve well in the watery plasma. So one of the things albumin can do is bind to them and help carry them through the blood. Another major group of blood proteins are the globulins. This is a fairly diverse group of proteins, but many of these come from the liver. Others are made by specialized cells like immune cells and others elsewhere in the body. They serve a variety of functions. For example, plasminogen is involved in dissolving blood clots. Transferrin is involved in moving iron around the body. Antibodies and complement proteins are involved in immune functions. And other globulins are also involved in things including more transporting of the lipophilic molecules to help move lipophilic things around in the blood. And finally, the other major group of plasma proteins is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen plays a major role in blood clotting. We'll talk about that more a little bit later when we talk about thrombocytes and the process of coagulation. And then a tiny fraction of plasma proteins are things like hormones. Some hormones are proteins, but those make up a very, very tiny proportion of plasma proteins, so I'm not going to list them on here, I'll just mention them. And next we're going to talk about the formed elements.